Thus, teachers and students of the Black Revolt held their breath in anticipation of an epic history of Malcolm X's trajectory toward black liberation. Tragically, Manning Marable knew he was seriously ill, and he successfully struggled to finish a book on this epic before he expired. This leaves us with an important contribution to the study of Malcolm X. However, it also leaves us with several dimensions of Malcolm's revolutionary trajectory unexplored. Where do we go from here? On the subject of Malcolm X and black liberation, Manning Marable touched on the subject of Malcolm X and communism. However, there is nothing on that subject more important than Malcolm's consideration of the Marxist analysis of black self-determination as the alternative to racial oppression and colonial exploitation. Malcolm X surrounded himself with a host of black left veterans involved with developing the theory of self-determination, from Negro liberation and grassroots Garveyism to black liberation and Pan-Africanism. However, we have grossly neglected the voices of radical black women in those strategic circles, including those of Vicki Garvin, Queen Mother Moore, whom I'm sure, I hope many folks in this room are familiar. Those radical women were at the cutting edge of developing a blueprint for black liberation in the anti-colonial age of the Bandung Conference, third world politics, and radical Pan-Africanism. Through conversations and collaborations, Malcolm, Vicki Garvin, and Queen Mother Moore explored the strategic relationship between reform and revolution that he termed the choice between the ballot or the bullet in his famed 1964 speech. By neglecting these conversations, the Marable biography overlooks Malcolm's critical engagement with the national question that defined African Americans both as a racially and nationally oppressed community entitled to self-determination and as part of an imagined global community of people of color fighting against white supremacy and colonialism. Indeed, the book suggests that nationalism and communism are mutually exclusive political categories amongst black radicals. However, by the 1930s, there was no Chinese wall between black nationalism and communism in the United States. The political careers of women such as Vicki Garvin and Queen Mother Moore reveal that this was the case. Both women embraced an idiosyncratic black radical politics that drew from black nationalism, black feminism, Marxism, third worldism, and their own lived experiences. His exchanges with black women radicals, travels overseas, and Garveyite upbringing, as well as developments across the Bandung world, nurtured this perspective. Throughout his tenure in the Nation of Islam and following his break from it in early 1964, Malcolm sought to forge a black radical protest movement organically connected to African American urban communities and linked with third world revolutionary states across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. While the biography discusses Malcolm's interest in global affairs and his international travels, and here's the main kicker, the main argument of our piece, Marable portrays Malcolm near the end of his life, moving toward a political position that had forsaken the national question and demands for revolutionary change at home and abroad.
You meant portrays, not betrays, right? Portrays.
Portrays, I'm sorry.
Yeah,
I thought I said that, right?
I don't want to get into a
portrays. Oh, I'm so sorry. I thought I said portrays. Portrays.
Yeah.
Malcolm near the end of his life, moving towards a political position that had forsaken the national question and demands for revolutionary change at home and abroad, for electoral politics and liberal civil rights integrationism. This perspective, we argue, does not capture the complexities of Malcolm's politics and the contours of 20th century black radicalism. Centering black women radicals to the evolution of Malcolm's life and legacy provides keen insight into rethinking Marable's biographical portrait of Malcolm's political development. More broadly, this article offers insight into rethinking Malcolm X studies and black power studies by challenging the erasure of black women radicals and cultivating Malcolm's thought and forging black power. as well as the importance of the black left in laying the groundwork for black radicalism of the 1960s. And in the last few minutes that I have, again, this piece that that myself and Komozi are working on, again, is trying to center, trying to recover the importance of black women radicals to helping shape, helping to nurture Malcolm's politics. And I think that's quite apparent, for one, that both Queen, Mother Moore, and Garvin, they came from a kind of similar working class background for Malcolm, so certainly they could relate on those grounds. But also, again, this emergent third worldism, this emergent radical, black radical critique of the conditions in which black folks were facing. And I think, again, this is most apparent in terms of the influence that these women had. It's most apparent on Malcolm's global vision. And that Vicky Garvin, Maya Angelou, who of course moved to Ghana, who lived in Ghana, and of course Malcolm not only went to Mecca, but of course spent 10 very, very important days in Ghana. These women were central to organizing Malcolm's trip and introducing him, right? Introducing him to Nkrumah, to Shirley Graham Du Bois, and Malcolm himself. In the autobiography, mentions the importance that Vicky Garvin played. Also, and again, in light of time considerations, equally important is the role that black women played in keeping Malcolm's legacy alive following his assassination. So, of course, his widow, Betty Shabazz, but of course, again, Queen Mother Moore, of course, the founder or the person who developed the holiday for, or who called for a holiday for Brother Malcolm, and Vicky Garvin, who spoke during the 70s and 80s and 90s, who shared their memories of Malcolm with the new generation of black militants. So again, what this project is trying to do, and I should note that this conversation is largely absent, right, in the Manning Marable biography. And again, this is not to attack, we're not trying to engage in a kind of sectarian ad hominem attack against Professor Marable, an absolutely brilliant scholar. But at the same time, his book, we argue, right, ignores, again, the central role in which black women played, right, in the cultivation and radicalization of Malcolm's thought. In fact, just right quick, and I'm sorry, I didn't think that I was going first, but my chair here put me on first. So, again, I'm thinking out loud here, so please bear with me. Also, right quick, don't forget, and we often don't talk about this, right? Malcolm's parents, of course, were Garveyites. In the autobiography, and I'm going to wrap up here, Komozi, right?
You got 5.
Oh, I got 5. All right. Well, 5 means 10, right? Thank you, brother. Right. So that again, right?
But when this timer goes off, you'll know.
I will defer to my senior colleague here. All right. All right. All right. Indeed. Indeed. That Malcolm refers to Earl Little, his father, Baptist minister, as an inspiration for his militancy. And the autobiography frames Louise Little primarily as a victim, right, of mental health issues following the lynching of Malcolm's father. But the historical record, of course, was indeed more complicated than that. That Louise Little herself, who of course was from Grenada, right, was, like her husband, a devout Garveyite. She was a recording secretary of various local UNIA divisions. That's right, right? And that she imparted, according to Malcolm's daughter, she imparted this knowledge of Pan-Africanism, a global black perspective on her children. She required her children, right, to read the Negro world, right? She cultivated, she created a space in which Malcolm and his siblings could understand their lives in a much larger context. So again, what's important here, and again, this is largely absent in the biography. So again, what this piece is trying to do is, again, center black women, center gender, center sexuality to the conversation around Malcolm, and again, apply this to what is going on today. So again, we are at this left form. And again, going back to what I first said at the very outset, right? The ways in which race and gender and class, or rather race and gender sexuality, have so often kind of fallen off the conversation with Occupy, right? In fact, right quick, I actually got into a debate with an Occupy person, or rather a person that was at a protest, and he said to me, you know, the economy is colorblind. I said, what? I was like, are you kidding me? I was like, yeah, again, so again, like, the ways in which the white left, right, has historically ignored, to its own peril, right, questions around racial oppression, sexism, and homophobia. And again, we think that this article is, again, going to shed new light on Brother Malcolm, and hopefully on the Occupy movement. Folks, I thank you for your time.
Cheryl Green, one of the authors of Malcolm X Make It Plain.
Good morning. It is really good to be here. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
I'm so happy to see all of you.
You know, I'm sorry, you know, folks,
There's a couple chairs.
there are some seats over here. Yes, and we don't want to block the door in case there's a fire.
Here.
This is the Occupy legacy.
Yeah, we can share the space here.
It is a pleasure to see all of you this morning and to know that you've come to hear about and discuss Malcolm X. I myself am not an academic, and I'm an editor. So my work has been, through the years, on various projects, kind of behind the scenes. And I've been sort of witness to a lot of things. And I wanted to just share with you a little bit about the three major projects on Malcolm X that I've worked on. First project was with Black Side Inc., the documentary filmmakers who did Eyes on the Prize. We're doing a documentary on Malcolm X called Malcolm X Make It Plain. And I was the editor who put together the companion volume, meaning that I worked with all of the oral history material, about 1,000 pages of oral history material. I worked with the photo researcher, and I also worked with the writer, William Strickland, of the essay that is part of the book. And my job was to figure out how to tell Malcolm's story in that kind of form, with lots of pictures and with this oral history material and with the essay that gave the overview. So one of the things that became so obvious with the wonderful research that Black Side had done for the documentary was just what Erik was talking about. Malcolm's background that is not in the autobiography, Malcolm's family background, because there were interviews with his brothers, with his sister, with neighbors, with friends who grew up with him. And it began to present this picture of Malcolm that really wasn't so well known. I mean, I'm sure some people knew about it. There had been books done, and many people had been working in the vineyards for years doing research on Malcolm, but it wasn't widely known, and it became part of the documentary and part of the book. This sense that Malcolm came from a family of Garveyans, that there was this tremendous history behind him, that when his family was destroyed and broken up because his mother was put in an insane asylum, basically because there was a judge and people after the land that the family owned. His sense of self-determination, this sense of self-knowledge that his parents, both of them, passed on to the children was extremely strong. So anyway, it's a story that has many layers and that's complicated, and it hadn't really come out. The autobiography, because Malcolm was trying to tell a redemption story in the autobiography, he left out many things. he was trying to show what the nation had done for him. By the time he was at the end of working on the autobiography, his life had changed. And the purpose of the autobiography, although it changed, but it stayed the same because there was no time for him to go back to the beginning and start rethinking how he might tell his story. So anyway, that's a story unto itself. I'll get to that in a minute. But Make It Plain brought out all this about Malcolm's background that was so really revelatory. Okay, so then I worked for 3 years. I was managing editor of the Malcolm X Project at Columbia University, which laid much of the groundwork for Manny Marable's book. And the results of the project and the book, I am over here and the guy's over there. I ran the part of the project, for the most part, that created the multimedia online version of the autobiography. We deconstructed the autobiography of Malcolm X. There was a really big staff of students and researchers, and I ran it on a daily basis. My conclusions about the autobiography and about the project in general are somewhat different from Professor Marable's, but in any case, I just want you to know that I was there. I have probably a lot to say about it. I haven't spoken about it before, but it again gave me insight. I brought what I knew from the Malcolm X Make It Plain project. There was a great influence that project had on the, it was called the Malcolm X Multimedia Study Environment. And it was created along with the Center for New Media Teaching and Learning at Columbia University. We interviewed Malcolm X's associates, and we interviewed scholars and writers about Malcolm and created an archive, as well as created this online teaching tool. And the purpose of the tool was that students could use it, teachers could use it, but with the idea that it could be made into something that could go to the wider world. As it turned out, unfortunately, because once the 3-year project money ran out, there was really no effort made to make this into a product that could go to the rest of the world, which was the intention, certainly my intention when I worked on it, was that it should go out to the world. In that respect, I would say that you have to look at projects that exist in terms of their purpose. And the purpose of this tremendous 3-year project ended up really being that one scholar got to use it. And it's used in classes on the campus of Columbia University, but it cannot be accessed outside of the campus because the rights haven't been cleared for all the multimedia. And now the project is, going on 10 years old. So anyway, that's part of the history of that. And then in 2001 and 2004, the Columbia project was 2001 to 2004. In 2005, by that time, Malcolm's papers, which had never existed for any scholar or anyone to use, by that time they had been donated to the Schomburg Center. There's a whole history about those papers being, in Betty Shabazz's basement, et cetera, being almost auctioned off. The family reclaiming the papers. Eventually, they were given to the Schomburg. They were given to the Schomburg, and the Schomburg decided. My co-author, William Strickland, they were given to the Schomburg. They were given to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in Harlem, and the Schomburg decided to have an exhibition that would reveal and give samples of the papers to the public, so the public could look.
Musical chair, that's okay. Without the music.
The public could see the papers. The public could experience more of Malcolm's life than had ever been available. I mean, there were scholars and there were people who were dedicated to getting the history of Malcolm out for many, many years. But for one of the most major figures of the 20th century, there had never been papers. There had never been, you never knew what his papers were like. I mean, people really you have to give them credit for what they came up with, based on the fact that they only could deal with his speeches and some few letters and interviews and that kind of thing. Malcolm's actual papers, the letters he wrote, the diaries he kept, you know, his memorabilia, none of that had ever been available. So it's really quite extraordinary that the knowledge that we had of Malcolm was there to begin with. It's a testament to the dedication of people who spent many, many years trying to get that information out and making sure that it was available. So I have great respect for all of those people who did that work. And I had the honor and privilege of being a curatorial and research consultant on the exhibition that the Schomburg was going to present in 2005, which meant that I actually got to sit with his papers and touch them and feel them and look at them and see his handwriting and see, you know, the notes he made in the margins and all of that kind of thing. It was really an extraordinary experience. And people who are scholars know what this is like when you go into primary documents. The person is living through those pieces of paper and living through those objects. So that was an extraordinary experience. Okay, so I did all that. And I learned about all sorts of aspects of Malcolm's person, his style, his thoughts. I mean, for one thing, he was a thinker and a writer of extraordinarily dedicated approach. He wrote everything down, and you can find so much in his papers. I wanted to just today suggest some areas based on this kind of work that I've done on Malcolm. I wanted to suggest some areas that I think, in terms of both scholarly investigation and study, and also in terms of activism and organizing, that I just want to throw out some ideas for you guys to take with you and give some examples of how Malcolm dealt with these issues. I think, number one, the thing to consider and the thing to look at more and more in terms of where we are today and where Malcolm was as a leader is the quality and type of leadership that he provided. I think that that's something that is so key to understanding what he offered us, his value, and his longevity and his legacy. I'm going to use some stories, a few stories that actually involve women from some of the projects that I've done. So Alice Wyndham, one of the women you mentioned, who was in Ghana, and was one of the people who welcomed Malcolm and organized for him. One of the things that she pointed out in terms of the type of leadership that he provided, when Blackside interviewed her for the documentary in 1992, she said, it's courage and integrity. That the man was fearless enough to confront the United States government when it was at its most vicious, and he had the integrity to tell the truth and not to double deal. This is kind of encapsulates what so many people, I mean, everyone who was not Malcolm's enemy, I would say, came up with that kind of evaluation of his leadership and his person. People always talked about his discipline and his stamina and his sense of humor and his warmth and his sense of humanity. And so those are qualities. But I wanted to tell you a little story. There was a young woman named Amina Rahman in Harlem. She was 14 years old. She was becoming an activist, and at the Harlem Hospital was being, I guess, renovated or reconstructed or whatever, and there were nothing but white construction workers, and the community had organized to, protest this and demand that, black people be given some jobs on this site in Harlem. And Amina was part of the demonstrations that were taking place. And some of the people, this was 1962-63, she was 14 years old, and in the style of the civil rights movement, there were people lying down on the street to prevent the trucks that were bringing cement into the construction site. She was lying down with others in the street to prevent these trucks from coming in. And this will sound familiar to some of you in terms of some other area of the world where something like this happened. So one day, Malcolm's the lieutenant, I guess you would say, James Shabazz, 67, came up to Amina when she was lying on the ground and said, "Sister, the minister would like to speak with you." And she looked up at him and she said, "I'm sorry, I'm not moving. I'm here right now. My shift is not over yet." So he went back across the street and they stood and watched some more. And then James Shabazz went up to her again and said, "Sister, the minister would really like to talk to you." And she refused to get up. So eventually when her shift was over, she got up and went over across the street to talk to Malcolm. And I will just read you what she said. Because they got into an argument. She was 14 years old. I wouldn't say an argument. They got into a discussion. And she says, "We had a fighting argument that morning. He tried to explain to me what was wrong with my laying down on the ground in front of the cement truck. And I was trying to convince him of the rightness of what I was doing and how fearless I was about that construction truck and the workers. I was, putting my body on the line for the cause." And Malcolm said, "But that's because you don't really believe that that truck could run you over." And I realized that I didn't. I mean, I'd been pushed by police, had things thrown at me by angry whites on demonstrations in the South, but I clearly didn't believe that anybody would actually run over me with a truck. Malcolm posed that as a possibility, I talked about what we were doing in appealing to the moral conscience of the truck driver by laying our bodies on the line in front of that truck. And Malcolm said, "But that's because you think he has a moral conscience. Something that you ought to question, given the history of white people in this country have done to black people. If these are people who can lynch black people, murder black children, burn down churches, starve people, enslave people, why couldn't you run over somebody with your truck?"
Talking about Katrina?
Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry.
And he said, "Oh, they'd say it was an accident." He'd say, "Oops, my foot slipped."
That's right.
But you'd be just as dead from an accident as you would be if it had been done on purpose. It was quite a conversation, and admittedly, I'd never thought about that kind of thing. So she goes on to say that it was quite something that she was a teenager, and he was Malcolm X, and he was having a debate with her. She says, "I think people didn't often debate him like that, certainly not a teenager. And I think he had fun, and we became fast friends and frequent debaters after that." I don't know many leaders in business and government and civil rights organizations who make themselves available to ordinary people, and certainly not to teenagers in that way. I always felt respected. I always felt challenged. I came away from those meetings learning something, knowing something new. I always sort of thought that he got something new or learned something from me too. He was incredibly accessible and available, and just a great person to talk with about all kinds of things.
So that now then take 5.
First page. Okay. All right, let me just tell you, I just want to mention some of the other issues, because I think that the thing about leadership is really important. Okay, the other thing is Islam. I think that Malcolm had it hasn't been really fully investigated, his relationship to Islam. But one of the things I discovered, especially in reading his diaries, was that Islam was a bedrock issue for Malcolm. It was absolutely essential to his view of things. But he was really idealistic about it. He was idealistic about religion. I think he almost saw it as a kind of liberation theology that could change the United States, save the U.S., and save some other parts of the world. And he really had sort of kind of originally seen the Nation of Islam in this light for U.S. blacks, but when he broadened his perspective, he really saw Islam. And I think in light of where Islam is today, this is an interesting area to go into. He saw politics and religion as progressive forces. And I would just ask you to think about the implications of that for today's climate and compare his view, investigate his view of Islam and its role, and compare it to the organizing role of the black church in the U.S. and liberation theology in Latin America. So I wanted to suggest that. And I was going to read you some of his diary about Islam, but I didn't. Okay. The woman question is really essential, but I won't say any more